Army girl. The overhead page crackled through Seattle General's trauma bay at 1847 hours, and the entire floor went silent. Not the good kind of silence. The kind where fluorescent lights buzzed louder than voices, where every nurse at every station suddenly became very interested in their screens. Katie Morrison didn't look up from Bay 4. She was restocking the suture tray, 6-0 silk, 4-0 monofilament, the 2-0 chromic they always ran short on by shift's end. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, the kind that never quite leaves even when you're trying desperately to be someone else. The scissors clicked soft against the steel, a sound like a prayer said in an empty room. Army girl, your level 1 is arriving in 4 minutes. Better get ready. Dr. Mercer's voice dripped through the speaker again, and Katie heard the smirk in it. She heard the audience he was creating. Across the bay, the resident from Tulsa, what was her name, Reynolds, had her hand over her mouth trying not to laugh. One of the orderlies near the ambulance bay glanced over, checking Katie's face for a crack, for any sign that the nickname had landed. It hadn't. Katie's jaw was set like a bear trap, but her hands didn't hesitate. One more instrument into place. One more second of not reacting. The trauma shears came out of her pocket, her own pair, not hospital issue, and she used them to cut through the clear plastic packaging on a fresh set of gloves. The engraved handle caught the fluorescent light just right, and for a frame, maybe two, you could see the letters carved there, Valkyrie 6. A visiting resident from University of Colorado, tall guy with the kind of haircut that cost money, squinted at the shears. What's Valkyrie 6? Katie's eyes went flat. Absolutely flat. The temperature in the room dropped about 5 degrees. Old job, she said, and walked past him before he could ask what kind of old job required calling yourself a Norse goddess of the dead. She didn't glance at the clock on the wall. The mental count was already running. 4 minutes meant 3 minutes 50 seconds now. Meant an ambulance was already rolling north on Constitution Avenue, lights painting the evening dark in blue and red, meant someone was lying on that stretcher because something had blown apart on the other side of the world and still had the power to reach across 7,000 miles and take what it wanted. Dr. Mercer was already in the trauma bay when she returned, standing at the head of the main bed with his clipboard held like a scepter. He was 53, maybe 54, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses and the kind of authority that came from having never been told no by anyone who mattered. His white coat had his name embroidered in script, David Mercer, MD, like it was a brand. He was watching her. Not watching her work. Watching her, the way a hawk watches something smaller and slower and unaware. Presentation, he asked, not looking away from her face. 23-year-old male, the paramedic reported, already rolling the stretcher through the doors with the kind of speed that made every nurse in the bay straighten. IED strike, left lower extremity. Blast wave impact. Conscious and alert, vital stable for transport. The stretcher came into focus, and the world narrowed to a point. The young man on it had the kind of pale tan that comes from deployments, the kind that doesn't fade even after you're home. His eyes were sharp, military sharp, the kind that have seen things and counted them and filed them away. His left leg was wrapped in field dressings already, the emergency bandages that stop you from bleeding out but can't stop the real damage from happening inside. His name tag, visible on what was left of his uniform blouse, read, Chen, Est Staff Sergeant. Tikrit deployment. Katie asked. Her voice came out level. Professional. That was good. That was exactly what she needed. The young man's head turned toward her voice, and for a second, just a second, his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe. Or the kind of recognition that comes from knowing your own reflection in someone else's face. Jolin District, he said. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Charlie Company. Katie's hands went to work, cutting away the temporary dressings, assessing the true nature of the damage. The blast had hit from the left side, traveling up through the compartments, the muscle and fascia already beginning to swell with the pressure of inflammation and fluid that kills tissue just as surely as a bullet does. Compartment syndrome. She'd seen it 100 times. Seen it coming 100 times before the surgeons even walked in the room. "Get me the trauma kit," she said to Reynolds, who moved like she was operating on batteries. 14-gauge access, and I want 2 units of typo running before we hit the elevator. Nurse Morrison. Dr. Mercer's voice came from across the bay, sharp and cold as a scalpel. "This one's being reassigned. Staff Sergeant Chen is going to Bay 2 with Nurse Holloway." The words just hung there, suspended in the antiseptic air like they had their own weight. Katie didn't look up. She was still working, still assessing, still doing the job that no one, absolutely no one, had asked her to stop doing. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. The trauma shears in her pocket, the ones with her call sign engraved on the handle, they felt heavier all of a sudden, like they were made of something denser than steel. "Bay 2 doesn't have the setup for a fasciotomy," Katie said. Her voice came out quiet. Not meek. Not defeated. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from being absolutely certain about something and having learned the hard way not to waste breath arguing about certainty. "I'm aware of our hospital's capabilities, Nurse Morrison." Mercer was already walking toward the stretcher, already moving Chen away, and Katie saw the young man's eyes track toward her, just for a moment, just long enough to see something in his face that looked like the beginning of understanding something he didn't want to understand. Holloway was already there, already taking the hand off, already asking questions that were standard and procedural and missing the entire point. The stretcher disappeared into Bay 2, and the fluorescent lights buzzed their endless mechanical prayer. Katie set down her instruments. Methodical. One at a time. She stood there for 10 seconds, no more, no less, and let the silence build the way pressure builds in a sealed space before something breaks. Every nurse in the bay was watching. Every resident. Even the orderlies had stopped moving. Then she turned, and her eyes found Mercer's across the space between them. She walked toward him. Not fast. Not confrontational. The kind of walk that uses the whole room like it belongs to you. When she stopped, there was exactly 3 feet between them, and the air between them felt like it had a temperature. "Your insecurity is showing, Doctor." She said it the way someone might comment on the weather. Then she walked back toward her station, past Reynolds, past the residents, past the clock that was counting down to something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Her back was straight. Her hands were steady. But her knuckles were white around the trauma shears in her pocket, and Valkyrie 6 glinted once in the fluorescent light before she disappeared into the supply room, where no one could see what happened when she pressed the shears against her sternum and breathed like someone learning how to do it for the first time. The next voice that came through the overhead page was different. Not Mercer's. Not the intercom operator's. Not any voice that belonged inside Seattle General's trauma bay. "Seattle General. This is dispatch. We have a code yellow in progress. 7-foot male, armed with improvised weapon, 2-minute ETA to your emergency entrance. Stand by for police coordination." And that's when everything changed. The supply closet at Seattle General smelled like bleach and plastic tubing, fluorescent light casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made bruises look worse. Katie was counting intubation trays, 14, should be 16, when the door sealed shut behind her. Dr. Mercer stood in the frame, blocking the exit. His face had the red wine flush she'd learned to recognize, the one that appeared right before he needed to hurt something smaller than himself. "You questioned my discharge order," he said. His voice had that particular quality now, the one that made the air itself seem smaller. "You think your little military experience makes you qualified to second-guess me?" Katie's hand froze on the shelf. Her knuckles went white gripping the edge of the metal, her body recognizing the threat pattern before her conscious mind caught up. She didn't turn around. Didn't speak. Counted her breathing, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, the way she'd counted it in a field hospital in Tikrit with mortars walking up the perimeter. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 15. "That septic patient you discharged," Katie said, her voice level as concrete. "He coded at home. 1 hour post-discharge. His family found him in the kitchen. Mercer's breathing changed. She could hear it, the micro-panic of a man who'd built his authority on people not talking back. On people accepting that credentials meant righteousness, that a title meant you couldn't be wrong. I was right, Katie continued, still not turning. You weren't. She stepped away from the shelf, moving toward the door. Toward him. Her shoulder brushed his as she passed, not aggressive, just the simple fact of her body occupying the same space. The contact made him flinch. She could feel it. The door closed behind her with the soft hiss of hydraulics. Her hands were steady. Her breathing remained at 4 count. By the time she reached Bay 3, she'd already filed the interaction in the place where she kept all of Mercer's previous performances, not as insults, but as data points. Patterns. The pathology of a man whose power existed only in relation to those he could convince were beneath him. For days passed. Katie moved through her shifts with the same precision she brought to everything: medications on time, patients comfortable, assessments thorough. She stopped asking about Chen. Stopped looking for him in the census. Stopped letting her eyes drift to the trauma bay doors during shift change. Mercer's campaign had entered a new phase, one she recognized from her years working with insecure commanders: the public destruction. Private insults stopped working when they didn't land. When someone stood there like stone and didn't break. Shift change came at 5 p.m. The Colorado Springs November dusk had that particular quality: fluorescent day bleeding into actual darkness, the kind of light that made everything look like a photograph of itself. Katie was walking to her car when Mercer's voice carried across the parking lot, loud enough for the 20 staff members heading to their vehicles to hear. Morrison! He stood near the entrance, clipboard raised like a weapon, the overhead lights catching his polished shoes. The gathering was immediate. Phones appeared. People slowed their pace, the way crowds do when someone's about to be publicly executed. Effective immediately, you're reassigned from Level 1 trauma cases, Mercer announced, his voice pitched to carry. Competency concerns. You'll be reassigned to lower acuity work pending review. The parking lot went still. No one wanted to be near this. No one wanted to be the one he turned to next. Katie stopped. Turned. The stare came first, flat, cold, the color of a winter sky reflected in a frozen lake. The kind of stare that came from someone who'd looked down the barrel of worse things than a man with a clipboard. She let the silence build. 20 seconds. She could see his fingers twitching on the clipboard edge, the small involuntary movements that meant he was losing control of his own body. His jaw worked. He was waiting for her to argue, to cry, to give him the satisfaction of breaking something. Instead, she kept the stare locked on his eyes and spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far underground. Your insecurity is showing, Doctor. Then she turned and walked to her car. Didn't hurry. Didn't look back. In the rearview mirror as she started the engine, she could see him standing in the parking lot with his clipboard at his side, surrounded by staff who were suddenly very interested in their phones, their shoes, the distant mountains. His face had gone past red into the kind of purple that concerned her as a medical professional. She made a mental note: stress response at that level could trigger cardiac events. She almost cared. The next 48 hours moved in that strange suspended time where institutional systems process decisions that have already been made. Katie worked her shifts. Mercer didn't appear. There was a quality to the hospital that had changed, though, a kind of held breath among the staff. People made eye contact with her now. People who hadn't spoken to her in 3 months suddenly needed to discuss patient care. It was the small shift that happened when people realized someone wasn't going to break the way they expected. Then a patient arrived at 11:36 p.m. on a Tuesday. Level 1 trauma. Male, mid-20s, flown in from the VA Medical Center in Denver with a blast injury to the left lower extremity. The details came through before the patient did: IED explosion, 3 weeks post-injury, treatment at Walter Reed followed by VA transfer, now presenting with acute complications and requiring specialist evaluation. Katie was restocking the trauma supply cart when the doors burst open. The stretcher came through with that particular rhythm of controlled chaos, paramedic calling vitals, nurses moving with the choreography of a dance practiced 10,000 times, the smell of field dressing and antiseptic and something else underneath, something that smelled like sand and diesel and memories Katie had learned not to access during working hours. She looked at the patient's face. Everything stopped. Not the way it stops when you have a heart attack, more like the way the world stops when you see someone you died with walk through a door. Staff Sergeant Chen. 23 years old. The medic who'd rotated into her forward operating base in Tikrit, the one who'd taken the rotation schedule she'd held, the one who'd learned the procedures on the patient she'd had to release. The one whose face had been on the casualty report 3 months after she'd left the country, listed as KIA along with 4 others in a convoy ambush en route Fran. Except he was here. Breathing. Unconscious and bandaged but undeniably, impossibly alive. Katie's hands moved automatically. They'd learned this dance long before her conscious mind caught up. Peripheral line, fluid administration, O2 assessment, the familiar sequence of actions that meant help. Her breathing remained steady. Her movements remained precise. But something behind her sternum had stopped keeping time. "Do you know him?" asked Nurse Davis, the one who'd picked up the septic patient after Mercer reassigned him. "We served in the same area," Katie said. The truth. Nothing more. She was setting up for surgical prep when Mercer appeared in the doorway, reading the chart with the focused intensity of a predator who'd smelled blood. His eyes moved from the patient to Katie and something shifted in his expression, not quite satisfaction, more like a choice being made. A final escalation. "Morrison, you're reassigned," he said. Katie didn't look up from the for she was placing. "I'm mid-procedure, doctor." "I said you're reassigned." She finished the line. "Check the flow. Tape the site with movements that had no wasted motion." Then she stepped back and moved toward the door. As she passed Mercer, she could smell his cologne, expensive and bitter, could feel the heat coming off his body like he was burning from the inside out. "Nurse Davis has the case," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Katie walked to the supply closet and gathered her personal items. Her badge. The trauma shears with Valkyrie 6 engraved on the handle, the call sign from the team, the name the men had called her when they didn't have her rank to hide behind. She turned the shears over in her hand, feeling the weight of them, then placed them back in her scrub pocket. In the trauma bay, Davis was working through the assessment. Chen's leg was already beginning to swell slightly. Katie could see it, that subtle increase in circumference that meant pressure building underneath. Compartment syndrome. She knew the timeline. Knew the math. Knew exactly how much time a muscle could survive without blood flow before the damage became permanent. She stood in the doorway and watched Davis work, and said nothing at all. The leg was dying. Katie saw it the moment she stopped pretending not to look. Bay 4, the monitor's green line steady as a metronome, but the limb itself, swollen tight as a drum, the skin mottled purple bleeding into white. Chen's foot already cooling. The distal pulse she'd checked 5 minutes ago had thinned to almost nothing, and now it was gone completely. Compartment syndrome. The pressure inside the fascial compartment was crushing blood vessels, starving the muscle and nerve. Without decompression, the tissue death would begin in earnest within the hour. After that, amputation was the only option. Davis was still working the upper extremity, methodical and slow, unaware that the clock below the waist had already started counting down. Katie moved to the bedside and pressed her fingers into Chen's shin. The tissue beneath was hard as concrete, unyielding. She ran her thumb along the skin and felt the tension singing through the fascia like a guitar string 3 notes away from snapping. Chen's eyes were half closed, morphine washing through him, but when she pressed the foot, there was no withdrawal reflex. No pain response. That meant the nerves were already beginning to die. The intercom crackled. Katie had paged the on-call surgeon 5 minutes ago. She pressed the button again, her voice level as still water. Trauma Bay 4. Compartment syndrome, left lower leg. Distal pulses absent. Need immediate surgical decompression. The voice that came back was tired, irritated. ETA 30 minutes. I'm coming from home. Just keep him comfortable. 30 minutes. Katie did the math in her head the way she'd learned to do it in Tikrit, quick, brutal math that reduced human bodies to timelines and triage. Muscle ischemia time, 60 to 120 minutes before irreversible damage. Chen was 45 minutes into it. Maybe 50. That left him with a window of 30 to 75 minutes of salvageable tissue. The surgeon would arrive with 15 to 20 minutes to spare if nothing else went wrong. If traffic cooperated. If he didn't stop for coffee. She looked at Davis. Where's Dr. Mercer? Off floor. Emergency case in trauma 2. He said not to call him unless someone was dying. Katie moved to the instrument tray. The fasciotomy blade was there, gleaming under the fluorescence. 2-inch stainless steel, sharp enough to part skin with almost no pressure. She'd done this procedure exactly 17 times in a forward surgical team in Tikrit, in a tent that smelled like diesel and copper and human fear. She'd done it in daylight and in darkness powered by chemical lights. She'd done it when the surgeon was present and watching and when he was dead and she was the only one left who knew how. The hand skills didn't forget. The muscle memory lived in her bones. But this wasn't Tikrit. This was Colorado Springs, and she was a civilian nurse in a hospital where the protocols were built like walls, where every deviation got documented and photographed and filed with 3 copies. Where a woman who stepped outside her lane, even to save a limb, even to save a career, became a problem that administration had to solve. She looked at Chen's face. His eyes were starting to glaze. The morphine was taking him down, pulling him away from the pain that his body could no longer process anyway. She saw the shape of the young man beneath the swelling and the trauma tape, and for just a moment she saw the medic too, the one who'd been part of her surgical team in that tent, the one who was supposed to be dead. Her hand moved to the trauma shears in her pocket. The ones with Valkyrie 6 engraved on the handle. The ones she'd kept for 18 years. She pulled them out and held them up to the light. The fluorescence caught the edge and threw back a reflection like a blade. She turned to Davis. Call the surgeon back. Tell him we're not waiting. What? Davis's voice went high. Katie, you can't, that's not. Call him. She was already moving to the supply cart, already pulling gloves with a sound like gunshots in the quiet bay. 14-gauge angiocath needle for the line, hemostats for the bleeders, for .0 suture for closure. The sequence built itself in her mind with the precision of a weapon being assembled. Tell him Staff Sergeant Chen's compartment pressure is critical. Distal pulses absent. Tissue viability window closing. Fasciotomy initiated. I'll have the incision ready for him to assess when he arrives. Davis stared at her. The surgeon said not to. The surgeon is a surgeon. I'm a combat medic with 18 years in a forward surgical team. This patient is losing his leg in the next 20 minutes if we wait. Katie's voice didn't change pitch. It didn't rise. It simply hardened. Became something different. The civilian nurse dissolved and something else took her place, something that didn't ask permission, didn't apologize, didn't hesitate. The call. Davis made the call. Katie prepped the site, skin cleaned with chlorhexidine in a clean red spiral, drapes positioned, the landmarks of the anterior tibialis compartment marked with the precision of a grid on a map. Chen's breathing had slowed under the morphine. She leaned close enough that he could hear her beneath the pharmaceutical haze. Staff Sergeant. I'm going to cut to relieve the pressure in your leg. You'll keep it. You understand. His eyes flickered. A terrible moment of recognition moved across his face. Do I know you? Katie didn't answer. She couldn't. The past and the present couldn't occupy the same space, not here, not now. She picked up the blade instead. The incision was 3 inches long, made between the tibia and the fibula, hitting the fascia precisely at the midline of the anterior compartment. The blade went through skin like it was offering no resistance at all, because her hands remembered exactly how much pressure was too much and how little was enough. Blood beaded along the line, minimal, controlled. Then she was through the skin and the fascia was right there, that white fibrous wall that had been stretched so tight it was crushing everything inside it. The fasciotomy blade made a second incision through that layer and the pressure released like air from a balloon, and suddenly blood flooded back into the foot and the tissue that had been grey was pink again and the whole leg transformed from a dead thing into something salvageable in the space of a heartbeat. The hiss of air escaping the pressurized compartment. The small sound of tissue remembering how to live. Chen made a noise, not pain, something deeper, a sound that came from muscle memory and nerve firing, the body's recognition of its own resurrection. His eyes opened wider. Katie was already reaching for the hemostats, already controlling the bleeders, already thinking 3 steps ahead to closure and documentation and the fact that what she'd just done would be written down in permanent ink and filed in a system that would eventually require an explanation. The surgeon arrived at 2:23 in the morning, 32 minutes after the incision. He moved straight to the bay, already looking at the monitor, already reading the chart, and then his eyes landed on the incision site and he stopped walking. Stopped breathing. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then he moved closer, his gloved hands gentle, evaluating the work with the precision of a man assessing a rival's technique. Who did this? His voice was quiet. Professional. Unreadable. Davis pointed. She did. The surgeon was quiet for a very long time. He didn't look at Katie. He looked at the fasciotomy site, the perfect landmarks, the clean incision, the way the tissue had already begun to pink up beneath the edges. He looked at the suture work with the care of someone examining a piece of art that had no right to exist in the parameters of a hospital bed at 2 in the morning. That's not in a nurse's scope of practice, he said finally, but the words carried no accusation. Just statement. Fact. Problem. Katie was washing her hands. The water was hot enough to sting. It was necessary. It was perfect, the surgeon said quietly. He turned away to examine Chen more thoroughly. But that doesn't change the paperwork. He left the bay 10 minutes later after confirming that the limb would survive, that the tissue had enough blood flow returning, that Chen's career as a walking human being would continue. He didn't say anything else to Katie. He didn't need to. She already knew how the next hours would unfold. Dr. Mercer arrived at 2:35. He moved straight to bay 4 without knocking, without waiting, his presence carrying that particular density that made the fluorescent seem to flicker and dim. He saw the documentation first. He saw the surgical note. He saw the exact sequence of times, fasciotomy initiated at 0203, surgeon arrival at 0223, distal pulses restored by 0225. He saw the photograph someone had taken of the incision site before closure. The work was beautiful and clean and absolutely outside the scope of a nurse's authority. His face went through a sequence of colors. Red. White. Then something else. Something colder. Strategic. He photographed the chart with his phone. He photographed the notation beside Chen's name that read fasciotomy performed by nursing staff, see incident report. He photographed Katie's signature on the documentation. She was still washing her hands, water so hot her skin was turning pink, when she heard his voice behind her, quiet and controlled. We'll be having a conversation about this with hospital administration. Katie didn't turn around. She kept washing. The soap under her nails was rust-colored. The patient kept his leg. I'm sure he did. Mercer's voice had moved into something almost pleasant. Almost reasonable. That was the worst tone he'd ever used, the one that meant he was done being impulsive and had started being methodical. And we'll discuss that in detail when the board reviews your incident report. Because there's going to be 1. 3 violations of scope of practice, informed consent protocols, surgical procedure authorization. I'll be recommending immediate suspension pending investigation. He left. The air pressure in the room seemed to normalize after he was gone, like someone had closed a pressure cooker and let the steam escape. Katie dried her hands. She looked at Chen, who was sleeping now, his left leg salvaged and his career intact and his memories of her apparently still floating somewhere beneath the morphine. The trauma shears were on the counter, cleaned and waiting. Valkyrie 6 caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a prayer. By morning, the incident report was filed. By afternoon, 3 hospital policies had been cited in the formal documentation. By evening, a termination recommendation had been submitted to the board with Katie's name on it in triplicate. The hospital lawyer would call tomorrow. The questions would start then. The questions about scope of practice and authority and whether saving a patient's limb was worth the price of your career. By morning, the incident report was filed. 3 hospital policies cited. Patient consent forms questioned. Scope of practice violations documented with clinical precision. Dr. Mercer had threaded every needle perfectly, each sentence a small knife designed to cut without leaving obvious blood. The termination recommendation followed by noon, submitted to the board with a covering memo that read like poetry written by someone who'd been planning this for months. Which he had. 6 months of overhead pages, supply closet corners, parking lot humiliation, each one a brick in a wall designed to bury Katie Morrison under the weight of her own professionalism. The hospital lawyer's office was windowless. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like something dying slowly. She sat across from Katie with eyes that had seen this exact scene play out 100 times before, and the exhaustion in those eyes suggested every single version had worn her down a little more. The stack of papers between them seemed to grow as Katie watched, as if documentation could multiply through sheer institutional will. The trail is airtight, the lawyer said. She didn't apologize. There was nothing left to apologize for. Dr. Mercer has been building this for 6 months. The fasciotomy on Staff Sergeant Chen, unauthorized surgical intervention, scope of practice violation, patient consent documentation issues. The board reviewed everything this morning. They have to let you go. Katie didn't argue. She'd learned a long time ago that some battles were already lost before the first shot fired. She'd learned it in Tikrit, standing in a surgical tent while mortars walked across the compound in a line like some mad god counting. She'd learned it again when she chose to wear scrubs instead of dress blues, to save civilians instead of soldiers, to build a life where the weight of command stayed packed away in a locked part of her chest where she could pretend it didn't exist. I understand, Katie said. The lawyer slid the papers across the desk. Termination letter. Non-disparagement clause. Final paycheck calculation, $2,847 and change. Katie signed without reading. Her hands were steady. They'd held lives together in worse places than this. They could handle a pen. For what it's worth, the lawyer said, watching her sign, I don't think Dr. Mercer was wrong about the procedure being outside your scope. But I also think that patient would be planning an amputation instead of physical therapy right now if you hadn't done it. The board doesn't see that calculation, though. They only see the violation. Katie finished signing. Slid the papers back. The calculation was never theirs to make. That evening she stood at a bus stop on Tegent Street with a cardboard box balanced on her hip. The rain fell like applause on the pavement, steady and remorseless. Inside the box, a cracked coffee mug with drinkers serve coffee printed in faded letters. A succulent plant that was dying in precisely the way everything else in her life seemed to be dying, brown from the edges inward. A photograph in a frame, 3x5, the kind you could fit in a pocket or carry into a combat zone. Her ODA, Operational Detachment Alpha, from 2012. 8 faces. 3 of them were gone now. Killed in action. She never looked at that photo without counting the missing ones first. Her breath fogged in the cold air, small clouds that appeared and disappeared like thoughts she couldn't hold onto. The rain made the world smell like concrete and rust and the green copper scent of coming winter. A car passed. Splashed gutter water across her boots. She didn't move. Meanwhile, across town in a bar with leather chairs and a $200 wine list, Dr. Mercer was celebrating with 2 colleagues from the hospital's surgical department. Both of them had contributed letters to his file, small moments of support that had bolstered his case. The three of them clinked glasses with the satisfaction of men who'd successfully eliminated a problem. Sometimes you have to protect the institution from people who think rules don't apply, Mercer said. He was riding high, loose-limbed with victory. No matter how competent they are. No matter what they've supposedly done somewhere else. Rules exist for a reason. His colleagues nodded. One of them ordered another round. Mercer was already texting his wife about cancelling dinner plans. He wanted to stay out tonight, wanted to feel the weight of his win a little longer. The fasciotomy would have violated protocol. Would have exposed the hospital to liability. He'd done the right thing. The necessary thing. The thing that protected everyone. He didn't know what was happening 3 floors above him in the hospital's main building. He didn't know that Staff Sergeant Chen had woken up in his bed at 11:19 p.m. with his left leg wrapped in bandages and no pain in the compartment, just the clear sensation of saved tissue, of nerves and muscle that were still alive because a woman had made an impossible choice. He didn't know that Chen was asking the night nurse about the woman who'd saved him. He didn't know the answer the nurse gave, the flat statement delivered without context, Morrison. She's gone. Fired this morning. Chen went pale. The monitor beside his bed registered the spike in his heart rate, the sudden acceleration of blood pressure. He grabbed his phone with trembling fingers, ignored the timestamp, and called the Veterans Affairs office that had been handling his case. The duty officer picked up on the second ring. What was the first name of the medical officer who processed my intake at the VA hospital 3 weeks ago? Chen's voice was shaking. The one with the scar on her left hand. The nurse practitioner. The duty officer put him on hold. Came back in 90 seconds. Catherine Morrison. Why? Chen closed his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a whisper, the kind of whisper you only heard in places where people had seen too much. Valkyrie 6, he said. Oh my God. She was Valkyrie 6. He made another phone call. Then another. By 2 in the morning, the phone lines connecting Seattle General's board of directors to their homes had come alive with messages. Emergency session. Tomorrow morning. Non-negotiable. A patient was demanding to testify. 3 days later, the boardroom reconvened. The space smelled like old leather and the faint chemical scent of furniture polish. 18 people sat around a table that cost more than Katie Morrison made in 6 months. At the head sat the board chair, a woman with silver hair and the kind of face that had learned long ago not to show surprise. At the other end sat Dr. Mercer in a charcoal suit, his documentation stack in front of him like armor. The doors opened. Staff Sergeant Chen wheeled in wearing his dress uniform jacket, his left leg wrapped and splintered, his bearing so rigid it looked like it might shatter. Behind him walked someone from Veterans Affairs. Behind that person walked a chaplain in dress blues, carrying a folder that was marked Unit History, Classified Elements Redacted. The board chair gestured for Chen to speak. Saved my life twice, Chen said. His voice was steady, the voice of someone who'd learned to speak under fire. Once in Tikrit when she was my commanding officer. And once here at Seattle General when she was my nurse. The fasciotomy she performed would have cost me my leg without it. That's not a violation. That's triage under pressure. That's everything we're supposed to do. The room went dead silent. Mercer's face began to change color, like someone watching their life drain away through a hole they couldn't see. The chaplain stood. Opened the folder. His hands were shaking. Colonel Catherine Morrison, he began, and the word colonel seemed to echo off the walls. Special Forces, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. 3 combat deployments. Commanding Officer of the Surgical Team attached to Tactical Operations Center Tikrit, 2012. The staff in the room had pulled out phones. Were filming. Were texting. The name was spreading through the hospital like electricity. 16 hours, the chaplain continued, and his voice had changed, had become the voice of someone reading scripture. The TOC came under sustained mortar fire. Enemy forces attempted to overrun the medical facility. 43 casualties processed. 87% survival rate. That survival rate, under fire, with 2 of her 3 surgeons killed or wounded, would be impossible if she hadn't been there. Impossible. A rear admiral in dress whites walked through the door, boot heels striking tile with the sound of a gavel. His presence seemed to compress the air in the room. He moved to the table, looked directly at Dr. Mercer, and began reading from a citation that had been written 17 years ago. "Silver Star," the admiral said. Each word landed like a physical blow. For sustained service under fire. For saving 34 lives while operating a surgical facility under mortar attack. For returning fire with her weapon while maintaining surgical sterility. For refusing to leave her post despite 3 direct orders to evacuate. He paused. Let the silence do its work. 2 Bronze Stars, he continued. For leadership under impossible circumstances. For making triage decisions that saved lives at the cost of her own safety. For commanding a team through a siege that killed 70% of similar forward medical units nationwide. 2 Purple Hearts. Shot once through the left shoulder. Shot again through the upper abdomen. She sutured her own wound after the second shot and went back to operating. The room wasn't just silent now. It was the kind of silence that had weight, that had pressure, that seemed to push down on everyone except the admiral and the chaplain and Staff Sergeant Chen in his wheelchair. A man in a charcoal suit, no visible credentials, no name tag, approached the table. His presence was understated, which meant his authority was absolute. He was from Langley. Everyone knew this without being told. The call sign Valkyrie 6, he said quietly, refers to 3 classified operations conducted between 2011 and 2013. Details remain sealed. What I can tell you is that the survival rates under Colonel Morrison's command were 20% higher than baseline expectations. That she received a commendation from the Director of Special Operations Command. That she is one of the most decorated medical officers in the history of Special Forces Command. He turned to face Dr. Mercer directly. Dr. Mercer, did you know any of this when you filed the termination recommendation? Mercer couldn't speak. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like something mechanical had broken. Someone started clapping. It was Chen. His hands came together in the silence, slow at first, then faster. One of the board members joined. Then another. Then the whole room was applauding, not for the medals, not for the commendations, but for the woman who'd walked toward a 7-foot armed man in a parking lot with her back straight and her hand steady, who'd refused to flinch, who'd saved a patient's limb because it was the right thing to do and not because anyone had given her permission. Dr. Mercer's hands moved through Katie's personnel file like a man searching for a life raft in open water. 2 days had passed since the board meeting, and he couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. Couldn't stop replaying the moment when Chen said her name like a prayer, and the room shifted beneath him like a building settling on a fault line. He needed something. Anything. A policy violation she'd missed, a certification that had lapsed, a single thread he could pull that would unravel this nightmare and put him back where he belonged, in charge, unchallenged, restored. The file smelled like old paper and institutional weight. He opened it in his office at 2:16 a.m., the door locked, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of a morgue. His fingers trembled as he turned the pages. Katie Morrison. Hired 3 years ago. Clean record. References from civilian hospitals in Seattle, before that a gap of 14 years he'd never questioned because nobody questioned anything about her except him. Then he saw it. Classification stamps. Black ink on white paper, the kind of marking that belonged in federal buildings with guards, not in a Colorado Springs hospital file room. Classified. Need to know basis. Special access required. His breath caught in his throat like a hook. Colonel Catherine Morrison. Not captain. Not major. Colonel. Special Forces Command. 14 years on active duty. 3 deployments. The paper listed only dates and locations, Tikrit, Kandahar, somewhere redacted entirely. Below that, Silver Star. 2 bronze stars with velar devices. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. The medals were listed like accusations. Mercer's vision tunneled. His chair creaked backward. He read the words again, hoping they'd scramble into something different, something manageable, something that didn't mean he'd spent 6 months systematically destroying a decorated combat surgeon because she'd questioned his judgment. And then, below the medals, a single name in brackets. Valkyrie 6. The trauma shears. God. The shears he'd watched her clip to her belt 1,000 times, the ones with the call sign engraved on the handle. He'd thought it was a joke. Some ER nurse affectation, like how paramedics named their ambulances. But that wasn't the worst part. The file indicated 3 additional operations marked completely redacted. Entire paragraphs blacked out with the kind of permanence that meant Pentagon classification, meant CIA, meant the kind of wars nobody admitted fighting. 3 missions. 3 redacted. 3 reasons why a woman would be trained to cut a fasciotomy in an emergency situation with the steady hands of someone who'd done impossible things under fire while other people screamed. Mercer closed the file with shaking fingers. His computer screen glowed at him from the corner of his desk. The security footage from the night of the fasciotomy. He'd reviewed it 17 times, looking for some angle he could use, improper technique, patient confusion about consent, any frame that showed hesitation or error. There was none. She was flawless. She was a surgeon operating in a trauma bay like she'd done it 10,000 times before. But if the file disappeared, if the video disappeared, then the story could be different. He could claim she'd fabricated credentials. That she'd lied about her background. That she was unstable, that she'd performed an unauthorized procedure in an altered state, that the whole thing was a break from reality that he'd tried to manage compassionately. His hands moved across the keyboard before his rational mind could stop them. Hospital system access. Security archives. He found the files. 23 segments from that night. Him trying to delete them felt like the only thing in the universe that made sense. 7 segments deleted. 14 remaining. The deletion bar crawled 40%. 60%. 80%. 92%. He didn't know that Marcus Webb, the IT specialist, was a Marine veteran with 14 years in signals intelligence and an instinct about system access that never failed him. Webb saw the deletion attempt at 2:54 a.m. in real time, a flag on his monitoring dashboard that made him sit up straight in his apartment and reach for his laptop. Mercer hit final delete at 3:01 a.m. Webb had saved every frame to 3 separate encrypted drives by 3:02 a.m. By 3:15 a.m., he'd forwarded the deletion attempt, the security footage, and the hospital access logs to the State Medical Board, Hospital Legal, the police, and the FBI field office in Denver, because attempting to destroy evidence of a medical procedure wasn't just a policy violation, it was a federal crime. By 9:51 a.m., Dr. Mercer received a summons. The State Medical Board hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. His attorney called him at noon, voice flat. "They have the footage. They have the logs showing you accessed the files. They have your attempt to delete them. I'm recommending immediate cooperation and a resignation with cause." "There has to be." "There isn't. You tried to destroy evidence of a procedure that you now know was performed by someone with command authority and specialized medical training. That's fraud. That's obstruction. That's attempting to cover up a military-grade surgical intervention by creating false evidence." His attorney paused. "I can't help you with this. I won't help you with this. Find another lawyer." The phone went dead. His wife left on Friday. She packed a single suitcase with the kind of methodical purpose that meant she decided this in advance, possibly the moment she saw the news alert about the federal investigation. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just looked at him in the kitchen of their 4,200 square foot home and said, "I can't be married to someone who destroys people to protect himself." She looked almost sad when she said it, like she was grieving something that had already died. By Monday, the hospital had suspended him with cause. By Wednesday, two of the surgeons who'd publicly supported his concerns about Katie's credentials had issued statements distancing themselves. By Friday, his own lawyer had stopped returning calls. He sat alone in his car in the basement parking garage at 6:17 p.m. on a Thursday, hands shaking on the steering wheel, replaying the board meeting in his mind. The way Chen had spoken her name. The way the room had moved toward her like gravity itself recognized the difference between a man and a legend. The way a rear admiral had listed her commendations with the kind of respect that made Mercer understand, finally, that he'd never been competing with anyone. He'd been swinging at shadows and calling them giants. The parking garage was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of rain hitting the concrete above. Mercer had destroyed his career trying to destroy someone who'd survived wars. Someone who'd saved lives under circumstances he couldn't even imagine. Someone who'd come to work every day for 3 years asking for nothing but the chance to heal people and be left alone. And he decided that wasn't enough. He decided she needed to be smaller. 6 months later, Katie Morrison stood in Trauma Bay for at Seattle General, reinstatement papers in her personnel file, full back pay deposited over her objections, a formal apology from the hospital board framed in her locker like a joke nobody laughed at. Her colonel's insignia hung on the wall beside her nursing license. The board had insisted, she'd reluctantly agreed to it, and now it caught the fluorescent light every time she moved past it, a reminder that they knew, everyone knew, and the work continued regardless. She pulled trauma shifts because that's what she'd chosen to do. The quiet work. The work that mattered. Staff Sergeant Chen came in twice a week for outpatient physical therapy, walking on the leg she'd saved twice, once in Tikrit when she was his commanding officer and the IED tore through his unit, once here in this bay when compartment syndrome was stealing his future and nobody had given her permission to stop it. The ER doors burst open at 11:43 p.m. on a Thursday. Multi-casualty accident. MVA on 25 northbound. 6 vehicles. Dispatch was routing patients to 3 hospitals. Seattle General was taking the first wave, and the first patient through the doors was catastrophe in human form. 7 feet tall. 400 pounds. Head wound bleeding like someone had opened a fire hose. Wild-eyed and screaming. A tire iron in his right hand, massive and dark with blood. Pain medication. Someone give me something. Now. Security was 20 seconds out from the adjacent station. Everyone else was 30 years away from the nearest exit. The night shift nurses ran. The ER resident backing toward the wall, hands up, making himself small. 2 EMTs froze in the ambulance bay, deciding between their professional obligation and survival. The charge nurse was already on the radio calling for more security, her voice tight with the kind of fear that came from understanding that inside a hospital, in a bay with limited exits, the people with pain medication were also the people most likely to be victims. Katie Morrison was at the central station charting a routine laceration when the doors opened. She didn't run. She didn't freeze. She stood, moved with the kind of fluid precision that came from making decisions while people were dying, and walked directly toward him. Sir. Sir, look at me. The man swung the tire iron in a wild arc. It passed 6 feet from her body. She kept moving. I'm Colonel Morrison. I'm the ranking medical officer here. Put down the iron and let me help you. Her voice wasn't loud. It had the snap of command, not aggressive, not cruel, just the steady certainty of someone who'd made impossible choices and lived with them. The man's eyes found hers for a half second, and Katie saw what was underneath the rage. Terrified. Bleeding. Desperate. Pain was information, and this man's pain was screaming. You're hurt, she said, 3 feet away, hands visible, trauma shears on her belt. I can fix that. But you have to let me. The tire iron drooped. His knees buckled. Katie caught him on the way down, eased him onto the stretcher that appeared behind her, started her assessment with the kind of automatic competence that meant her hands knew what to do because they'd done this 10,000 times before. BP 198/104. Laceration to the right temporal bone, approximately 4 centimeters, bleeding controlled with direct pressure. Pupils equal and reactive. GCS 14. Possible concussion, possible fracture, definitely pain requiring immediate intervention. 2 milligrams of morphine 4, she said to the nurse beside her. 14-gauge angiocath. We're going to get imaging and orthopedic consult for the arm. The man gripped her hand. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. I know, Katie said. You're safe. You're in a hospital and you're safe. We're going to take care of you. The staff watched from a distance, watched her work, watched the man's hand relax in hers, watched her move him through the bay with the kind of authority that came from understanding that healing wasn't just medicine, it was the decision to help even when running would have been safer. Especially then. Later, a young nurse with 2 years of experience asked Katie how she knew he'd listen. Why he'd put down the weapon when security was almost there. Why he'd given up. Katie looked up from her charting, thought of Tikrit, thought of Chen, thought of 6 months of being told she was just a nurse, just a veteran, just an employee at a hospital that hadn't earned the right to know what she was. Thought of the decision to work anyway. To show up. To move toward the threat instead of away. Power is not a title, she said. Power is the ability to help. She returned to her patients. The bay settled into its familiar rhythm, monitors beeping, footsteps on tile, the hiss of oxygen flowing steady and clean, the quiet work of healing that didn't need recognition because the work itself was enough. On her hip, trauma shears caught the fluorescent light. Valkyrie 6 engraved on the handle, still sharp, still ready, still exactly where she'd earned the right to be. Outside, rain hammered the hospital parking lot like applause from a world that didn't know her name. Inside, Katie Morrison moved between beds, hand steady, decisions clear, the kind of quiet that came from having survived the worst and chosen to help anyway. If this video resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Comment below, have you ever misjudged someone only to discover they were the strongest person in the room? Your stories matter. Let's build this community together.